would like a copy of this to be on our YouTube channel for those who will unfortunately miss out on the live session. So, so what could be interesting until we start is maybe everyone can introduce themselves and just give us a little bit background from where they're joining and sort of what are they hoping to discover in today's webinar. Okay, great. So we are live streaming on YouTube as well. Perhaps I'll give another minute for everyone to join us. Okay. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of 2022. We will be doing a lot of interesting topics coming. There'll be a lot of interesting topics coming to you during the year, continuing also on some of the areas that we have already discussed last year. So quite a lot of interesting things happening this year. So while inviting you to connect with me or with anyone here at My Science Work, let's dive into today's discussion. What I find great about changing times is that it sort of creates this fundamental opportunity to sit back, regroup, reevaluate. So basically, we think policies, we think systems and strategies. And on that front, today's webinar aims to explore current alternatives to the gold and the green OA models, open access models. Can new open access models emerge with new ways of publishing articles? Do publishers plan to invest in new OA models in the future? So first, let's get to know each other. I'm really thrilled to introduce you all to the three very gracious and brilliant panelists with me here today. Dr. Niamh O'Connor is the Chief Publishing Officer at PLOS, where she leads the publishing and partnership team. Her focus is ensuring the PLOS portfolio has a strong value proposition, and this includes the broadest range of researcher voices, facilitating the co-creation of paths to open science and that address the legacy of devaluing knowledge from particular groups or regions. This includes developing new business models to support open access and open science. Prior to PLOS, she was the Director of Publishing at the Biochemical Society, Portland Press, and spent 9 years at the Royal Society of Chemistry. She holds a PhD in chemistry from the National University of Ireland. We also have Dr. Heather Staines. She is the Senior Consultant and Director of Community Engagement at Delta Think. She received her PhD from Yale University in Military and Diplomatic History. Very interesting. She enjoys volunteering for professional organizations such as the Society for Scholarly Publishing, so SSP, the Council of Science Editors, the Charleston Library Conference, and the STM Association's Future Lab. We also have the wonderful Maridath Wilson. She is the Head of Scholarly Resources at Boston University Libraries and she holds various positions, including that of information expert at the GSTOR, and since 2020 as the Head of Scholarly Resources at Boston University. She's also a part of NERL, so Northeast Research Library Consortium, negotiation team for the recent Elsevier Transformative Agreement negotiation. And there you have it, today's panelists. So on behalf of My Science Work and all of you joining us live or watching this replay in the future, I want to extend a very warm welcome to each of you. So academic publishing, as we are well aware of, is rapidly transitioning towards a predominantly open access business model. There's the APC article processing charge model, then there's the institutional and consortium based models. But the tricky part of OA models is that it creates new inequalities as it resolves others. So on that front, I think a first good step is to sort of dive into current models and then explore how and why some models work and some simply don't. Dr. Staines, Heather, I'd like to hear from you about where we are with the green and the gold OA models in different parts of the world, and then perhaps you can share your thoughts on the trends that's happening, and if you see new open access models emerge and how have they been adopted up until now. So perhaps we can take it from there.
Hang on one second. I think I clicked on the wrong slide, and I think we want to make sure we give the presentation from today. So I think I need to change my cover slide later. So I'll get you a new cover slide. All right, let me come back and share again. Apologies for that. Sally took us through a nice screen sharing, and then I messed up her smooth transition, but that's what editing is for. So it's fantastic to be here today to get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is open access, and to bring in a little bit of history. I'm a historian, as Sally mentioned, by training, and so I think it's always kind of important for us to ask ourselves, where are we now in the scheme of things, and kind of how do we get here? So I'm going to kick off with super short overview, talk about some of the gemstones, as Maridath called them when we did our planning call. I'll touch briefly on transformative agreements and transformative journals. We can come back to any one of these, if you guys have questions. I want to talk about some of the things that we're hearing at Delta Think, some of the decisions that are being made, some of the processes that go into that. Take a couple snapshots from the data around some of these models and talk about how that might be influencing current trends. And then I have a slide with resource links as well. So it's going to be a quick dive through, and we can go, as I mentioned in the Q&A, into more detail. So super short, as a historian, I am well aware that like entire books are written about one bullet point or one word and one bullet point. But just to kind of situate where we are here, we talk a lot about the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002, but there were precursors to that, open access definitely existed before that time. There was the archive preprint server in high energy physics. There were requirements for publishers to submit content to PubMed, and Biomed Central was also founded before 2002. Commercial publishers started to get involved not too long after the Budapest Initiative. One of my previous roles was at Springer SBM before it was Springer Nature. And certainly the commercial publishers started to see activity in the OA space, and that led to a number of acquisitions. I learned about Biomed Central during the time that I was at Springer. Governments were also taking a closer look at how taxpayer-funded research should be made available. So you start to see mandates and attempts at mandates in the US. The Office of Science, Technology, and Policy first launched in 2013 with the goal of making all of the government departments OA. We know that hasn't happened, but Department of Energy and the National Institute of Health have made good progress there. Over in the UK with the HEFKey decision and the Research Excellence Framework that came in also 2013, big year to promote open. And in the European Union, Horizon 2020 launched in 2016. We also see universities and libraries getting more involved with declarations and mandates around OA. And also more funders taking the lead, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. One of the higher profile plans, of course, Coalition S is Plan S in 2018. We had the birth of transformative agreements, which some folks, including Lisa Hinchliffe in the library space, have referred to as the bigger deal, which is an interesting way to look at, does this just create lock-in with another name? And we have what I kind of refer to as business model bingo, not because it denigrates any model, but because it's very hard to keep track of with more and more models launching all of the time. So I was asked as part of this presentation to give a little bit of an overview of, what the more traditional models have been. The earliest OA journals were what we would now refer to as gold. They weren't necessarily all called gold at the time. And many journals were researcher-led journals that had no APCs before, things kind of coalesced around, what was open access. When subscription journals got into the game with the larger commercial publishers, hybrid became an option in many instances. Then we have Platinum and Diamond, which of course are models where there is no author paid APC, but of course some of the reasoning behind those models may be that it's temporary to do a launch, or it could be sponsored by pharma or by some philanthropic activity. So there are questions around the degree to which that can be sustainable in the long term, in its own way. And we should remember that open access is more than just free to read. So when we're talking with publishers and when we're looking at our data, we try to track separately what is sometimes called the bronze, and we tend to refer to as public access. So this is content that is free to read, but not free to reuse. Lots of questions about green, and we can talk in more detail about that. I think green was considered a pretty low risk way forward by a wide variety of publishing organizations at the time when it was hard to find, when repositories weren't very well indexed and metadata for green content was basically non-existent. So green, changing all of the time and how that fits with other models, could be something, really for the Q&A. In this space, I like to talk a little bit about the OA license types and whether or not they matter. There is lots of conversation around CC BY, which is the most popular of the Creative Commons license types. But some of that difference in license preference is by discipline. Historians and literature folks tend to maybe be more restrictive and want a non-commercial and a non-derivative license model rather than a CC BY. So these licenses are not distributed equally, and there can be specific licenses for repositories, for example, that are actually not Creative Commons, but are meant to replicate the protection, for the authors around reuse and commercial reuse, but under custom licenses. So transformation, who's transforming and what are they transforming into? As was touched upon at the outset by Sally, we're in this OA space. Are things happening quickly enough when governments get involved and funders get involved? Particularly it's with a mindset of let's accelerate this trend because we seem to be kind of stuck. So Plan S back in 2018 came out announcing that no APCs could be paid from their funding for articles in hybrid journals. This led many publishers to negotiate transformative agreements of a variety of different flavors with the institutions, and in other instances for publishers or organizations to declare their journals to be transformative journals to keep eligibility for funding that came in through Plan S. These transformative journals and agreements are intended to commit to a transition to fully OA. And the transformative part is the redirection of that money that once went for subscriptions to pay for OA services. There are two criteria that transformative journals need to meet, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second. A 5% increase in the absolute number of articles, and then a 15% increase in the relative number of articles. And those two factors can interact with each other in interesting ways over time. And one of the questions that remains with Plan S is what happens at the end of next year, at the end of 2024, I should say, because these journals are on their way, but it's unclear, how much progress they're making. So let's take a breath around transformative agreements. One of the best explanations that I've heard, again, has been some presentations that Lisa Hinchliffe has done. You have the agreements called read and publish, and they really have two parts. They take into consideration the traditional costs that subscriptions went to for reading the content, and then they put together an estimate of the APC costs that institution was paying, and they come up with an agreement called read and publish that covers those two elements. Other type of agreement is called publish and read, and that's calculated on the cost of publishing only, and then the reading gets thrown in, on top of that. So as a really quick rule of thumb, that's one way you can make that determination, but there's a whole array of other types of agreements out there. The American Physiological Society has something called read and publish and join, which takes into consideration some of the membership models that are challenging now with younger researchers not necessarily making the connection to society membership having a value. So that's an interesting to watch. We've got community funded models like Subscribe to Open and different flavors of that. And I'm not planning to talk about books today because books are really hard, but if anyone has questions about books, we can talk about that in the Q&A period as well. So I wanted to show you a little bit of information that Delta Think had collected around the historical OA uptake versus these transformative journal requirements that I just referred to. So this is from a News and Views that we published last spring. The link is going to be in the resource materials. So we looked at the last 3 years, and it seems that in order to meet that complete OA flip, the total number of papers published, it's just not growing quickly enough for these transformative journals to be able to move over, into that OA state by the end of 2024. The number of journals that successfully meet those requirements, is relatively small. Only a dozen or so out of the 2,000 that are tracked, and you can check where these journals are tracked. We have them in our data tool, but also on the ESAC site over in Europe. So it doesn't have met both targets in the past 3 years. 2/3 of them have, however, met one target or another. And when we think about the 75% OA uptake that's intended for these flips, only about 20 journals, or less than 1%, actually had that amount of OA uptake. And of course, as I mentioned, it varies a lot per field. We also wanted to look at historically how, if we took the data from 3 years prior, how these journals, had they been transformative at the time, might have performed. If we look at this pie chart like a clock, starting to read from 12 o'clock, only about a third met neither one of those transformative agreement targets. 28% met the relative, but they did not meet absolute. A tiny percent made the absolute and didn't get the relative. And then this bears out with our larger analysis, which says over time, it's harder to meet that absolute criteria because your journal has to keep growing at a certain rate. And no matter how many things you're publishing away, if the overall journal's not growing at that rate, you're not going to meet that requirement. So where do we go to from here? I just wanted to mention some of the questions that we're getting at Delta Think. Publishers are looking at areas where maybe there's a potential to launch a new journal. And we do track these launches and these new deals. Uptake of OA varies a lot by subject area, and I'll show you an example of that. Publishers are really looking at the market if they're going to select an APC model to see what pricing is being done. And that varies a lot by publisher. The subject area is different, and then the relative impact. Some journals can bear a higher APC than others. Publishers are making decisions about what licenses to use and how to tackle that rights retention strategy that the Plan S funders require. And we also see a different uptake regionally, and that has a lot of impact on equity and inclusion, which Niamh and Maridath are going to talk about. So super quick snapshot. We talk about OA uptake varying by subject. This is a snapshot around medicine. And you can come back and look at the slides later, but you can see the gold, the blue is the hybrid, the orange is the public access, and the gray is subscription. If we zoom in on one area, this happens to be radiology, nuclear medicine, and imaging, you can see the 4 boxes show the number of articles, what percentage content that makes in the discipline, and how that is changing over time. Excuse me. We also look at APC price ranges. So this is just a snapshot of medical publishers and which are the more common APC price points. We can see there for the medical publishers, it's sort of middle of the road for across the spectrum, with some very high-end journals bearing that plus 10,000 K APC. When we look at OA uptake regionally, and I like to draw attention to the bottom first, which is the uptake in Africa, 30% of researchers will utilize an OA license for their publication, but the little orange bit to the right of center shows that their overall contribution to the global share of research is small, so they can't really move the needle that much on their own. But on the top row, we can see in APAC, slightly less uptake than in Africa, but the output is almost 35%. So potential to make a large difference as far as that goes. What we're hearing from the data is that there was a huge growth in OA article output in 2020. Some people call it the COVID bump. It was 25% increase from 2019, and fully OA journals were able to expand more rapidly than their subscription counterparts. We also see across our historical data that APC prices are becoming more widely distributed as publishers get better at pricing on a journal by journal basis. The prices in general are going up. Full open access APCs are cheaper than hybrid. And on the March 30th, we're going to have more details with the update that includes the 2021 data. There's some resources that you can click on when the slides are distributed. And with that, I will hand over to Niamh.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for the insights. I want to move to CAP. So maybe Niamh, we will talk a little bit about PLOS, and in 2021, the beginning of 2021, we decided to launch this new open access model called CAP, Community Action Publishing. Basically, CAP aims to sort of eliminate the author APCs in order to make their most selective open access journals truly open to read and open to publish. So Niamh, to begin with, it would be interesting to hear why PLOS decided to come up with this new OA model. So what was the vision and how does CAP achieve it? And then sort of we can discuss where we are with CAP today, 1 year later, in terms of adaptation and also the performance. What are some lessons learned and what are some readjustments that have been made? Basically, where is CAP taking us?
Sure. So thanks, Sally. And I'm going to step back a little bit just as a start and talk a little bit about like what PLOS was thinking about. Oops, something funny's happened to the layout of my slide. My apologies. But when we were thinking at PLOS about kind of why we would have new models and really thinking about this move beyond the APC, the things that we were thinking about in that are that like APCs on their own really create a barrier to inclusion and knowledge sharing. They've been really great in taking us from a largely subscription-based model where, you know, the information was behind a paywall so that everybody is able to access it. But we now need to be able to move beyond that so that people are also able to participate in sharing their research results. Waivers, which seek to address issues around kind of people who are not able to pay APCs, they're really high friction, they're very problematic, and they're somewhat paternalistic. So, you know, they kind of identify people as marked out as different in their participation, which is what we don't want. We want this to be a system where everyone is able to take part. And also very often people don't know that they're eligible. It's not always that straightforward for people to keep track, particularly across different journals and different publishers, of what their entitlements are in terms of being able to access waivers for APCs. So when we're thinking about open science, we really know it has to be global, diverse, inclusive, and equitable. And we also want to be able to have transparent experimentation. And PLOS's role, ever since kind of the beginning of the open access movement, has really been to be a catalyst and try and accelerate change in research communication to increase the amount of openness in the system. And so we wanted to think about how we could do that through our business models, as well as through other aspects of our journals and the other activities that PLOS takes on. So in launching our new models, what we want to be able to think about is demonstrate that the new models work. So like sharing our successes, sharing some of the challenges through days like today, to experiment with different mechanisms for having fees and kind of taking on board what you were saying, Heather. Yes, there are kind of different business models out there. And I think we're in a period at the moment where we're moving away from open access equals APCs. And that's happening more rapidly in some areas than others. But I think that's a really important move that we have to make. And I think one of the challenges that exists for publishers, I mean, for everyone in the ecosystem, but definitely for publishers in this context, is to really think about how we can make this work in a different way and make it work in a different way where everybody can work together and benefit Because really what we want is for people to be able to share their research, to find other people's research, and to accelerate that progress for everybody to be able to benefit. So in any business model that we think about at PLOS, we of course wanted to align with our mission, and we want to eliminate those barriers to knowledge sharing. So apologies for the very text-heavy slide here, but the reason that I have lots of text is that I think when it comes to thinking about models specifically, it can be a little confusing if I just talk about it without it kind of being written down. So Community Action Publishing, or CAP, was driven by a very specific issue in the context of APCs. And, you know, Heather, if you were going through kind of the different points and different periods of evolution in open access, you know, one of the recent ones you mentioned was around the announcement of Plan S. And I'm sure many of you on this call will remember that there was a lot of discussion around the time the Plan S came out around what the impact was going to be on highly selective journals. And really thinking about this. And I know I heard a lot at the time people saying it's impossible to have a highly selective journal without having a very high APC. And again, this was pushing us back into this idea that open access equals APC. That's the automatic go-to place. And therefore, the only way to make selective journal work is that you must have a really high APC. So we were thinking there has to be a different way to do this, right? So PLOS has a couple of highly selective journals, PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine, had at that point. And so we were really thinking, how can we do this in a different way? Acknowledging that, you know, we were not comfortable with the idea that we would need to have very high APCs. It doesn't align with our values as an organization. And so we started thinking about how we could make a financially sustainable model that allowed for selectivity in a different, kind of starting from a different approach. And so, you know, that involved kind of working with different people, with looking at what was happening, with thinking about what we were really trying to achieve. And so, you know, the really great thing for us is that that did resonate with libraries. And I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who helped us in working with this. And my colleague, Sarah Ruhi, who spoke with many librarians as we were working through this to actually test our assumptions, to see kind of what worked and what resonated and what didn't. And really looking at kind of how we were going to make that model work. So the kind of major features of the model is that, you know, we look at our costs for publishing. This is all on the PLOS website. I'm not going to go into it in immense detail, but, you know, we look at for each journal, we look at what our costs are, what we would ideally want to have as a small surplus to be able to continue to innovate on the journal, to improve our offering, and also to meet the different requirements that come up from funders and be able to evolve as is required by our communities. And we look at that kind of cost to publish then based on the publication across both corresponding and contributing authors. And we do that for a number of reasons. So as it mentions here, the cost is more equally distributed, but there is also a really strong mission reason to do this. So if you think about what's been happening in the context of authorship and things like credit taxonomies, making sure that every author gets credit for their contribution to a piece of work. And we wanted to see how we could also reflect that in a business model, because one of the issues with APCs is that they're always paid, or traditionally have been paid, largely by the corresponding author, or at least they're thought of in that sense. And so we wanted to think about how we could distribute that cost in a different way. And so CAP is an institutional membership model. So people join the community. And initially, that was for PLOS Biology. There's a separate community for PLOS Medicine. And we are very clear about what our financial target is. If we then meet that financial target, any revenue exceeding that amount is redistributed back to members of the community at renewal. We also continue to have non-member fees for publication in the journal for people who are coming from institutions that are not members of the particular community. And so going back to, the PLOS biology and PLOS medicine, those CAP communities started it in 2021 was the first year. We've been very pleased with the response. We found that the conversations that have happened with libraries and consortia have been very positive. People have been particularly, I think, appreciative of the transparency, and that's something that's come through very clearly to us. And we've also seen now some comment coming from researchers kind of wanting to know where they're seeing people they know who have access or whose institutions are members, that they also want to be able to do this, because it removes the barrier for them, because there is then no fee as they come to publish. And because of this kind of positive impact, we've actually introduced a third CAP community for our newer journal, PLOS Sustainability and Transformation. And so that's one of our journals, one of our new journals. And the reason that we chose to launch that with a CAP model is because of its subject area. So again, it met our criteria in terms of thinking about selectivity, because this is a model that is designed for selectivity. But at the same time, we saw that to be able to publish the kind of research we wanted to be able to publish in a sustainability and transformation journal, not everybody coming to that is likely to have funding from a funder to pay an APC. And so we felt that it fit very well with this model, and also pushes our experimentation a little, because that's CAP for a new journal. And so it's coming from a slightly different start point from those for PLOS biology and PLOS medicine. And so one of the, as we were thinking about coming into today, I think one of the questions you raised, Sally, and I wanted to pick up on was just, is PLOS thinking about other models as well as CAP? And the answer is yes. So for 3 of our new titles, we actually have a model called Global Equity. So I just wanted to take a moment to think about, to introduce any of you who aren't familiar with it to that as well. So again, this thinks about our potential participants of corresponding and contributing authors. But in this instance, we're also taking into account the country in which the institution that those researchers are based, and the World Bank lending class of that country. So is it a high income country, low middle, middle income country, low middle income, low income country? So in this case, unlike the communities for PLOS biology and PLOS medicine, this is a straightforward kind of annual fee. With everybody who is based at a Research for Life country, those institutions can automatically participate free of charge. There's also an equity contribution option, which I'll come back to in a moment. But again, with apologies for much text on the slide, our aim here really is to make open access equitable. And again, picking up on those conversations that have been happening around kind of whether it's possible to have different levels of open access cost for people who are coming from different economic circumstances. And I think there were 2 really big things in it, that like that push for people in different countries was one, but also, something that I think all of us are really familiar with as a big challenge in the transition to an open access ecosystem is the challenge for research intensive institutions who find that actually the financial pressure on them, if they have a huge number of publications, is really different from what it was in a subscription type model, where the cost was spread across a huge range of institutions, where people were reading and using the content. So we wanted to take account of both of those features. And in doing that, we have come up with a model which basically does involve an annual institutional cost, which takes into account both the institution's publication record in the field. And remember, these are new journals, so we're not able to currently make this about specific history in that title. So we're looking at the field, and also then the World Bank lending tier of the country. So it means, that the amount that somebody pays, there's a matrix, again, you can find it on our website. It's very straightforward. It's not actually very complicated. There are just a few tiers, and people can see then where they fit, and be able to participate. And we're also really interested in seeing that this is it's a newer model, so it's a little early to give feedback. It's the journals have just begun publishing. The first of them published, say, the end of last year, others through this year. So we'll be interested to see how this develops kind of through 2022, and hopefully this time next year be in a position to comment on how its first year has been. And just going back to the final feature that I mentioned on the previous slide, which is around the equity contribution. This works on the principle that institutions in high income countries have the option to pay a little extra to reduce the cost for institutions, particularly in the kind of low middle income bracket. So obviously they're the group who are don't have to pay to participate, but there are others who do, and there is that option for any institution who wishes to do that and is in a position to be able to. And I totally recognize in saying this that a lot of the ability to make that choice depends on where funding comes from, depends on people's process, and the freedom they have, to be able to make a choice to do that. So that's not a choice that everyone can make, but it is that some can and some would like to. And so just as a kind of final slide, that, giving you a quick overview of the different models that we have. So, we still have our APC-based model where people can come and pay on individual article basis, or obviously on an institutional sort of per article basis. We do have some flat fee agreements, so that's where we negotiate individually with institutions or consortia to cover the cost of publication, and again that's based on publication history. And then the two, community action publishing and global equity, that we've spoken about, really experimenting to try to find ways to move open access beyond the APC. And all of this is really contributing to what we want to be able to do at PLOS, to our mission to build an equitable system of knowledge, to really be able to move towards an open to read, open to publish circumstance. And a hugely important thing for us is working closely with our library partners, with consortia, to really be able to build that trust for the long term, because without that, we can't experiment successfully to make these changes. And I think, that's not a straightforward thing necessarily. And I that's not because everybody isn't willing, but it's because I think it has been the case that very often these kinds of negotiations in the past have been very contentious. I don't mean that PLOS particularly, I just mean in a general sense. And so really trying to take an approach that, as my colleague Sarah would describe it, of radical collaboration, of really wanting to do things differently, to think of this as a collaborative process. We all want to be able to make research move forward. And so we have to be able to build trust and partnership to be able to do that. And ultimately to remember that, the money that's driving the research, the money that is driving the ability to share it through publication, is by and large public money. And we want everybody to be able to benefit from that investment and to really be able to drive progress in society as a whole. And if I sound like an idealist, that's because I kind of am, but I think it's really important to remember that that's why we're all here. And with that, I'll say thank you very much and hand over to Maridath.
Thank you, Niamh. Very promising stuff there. And to echo Robin, who just voiced her thoughts on the chat, indeed, PLOS transparency about their pricing really sets standards. And I wish, she wishes, as do pretty much all of us here, that all publishers could meet these standards. Okay. I would like to hop on to Maridath because we have 20 minutes to go, and I would like to have at least 10 minutes for the Q&A. So the onset of OA publishing has, in a way, altered, for lack of a better word, traditional relationships between the many different stakeholders within the scholarly communications landscape. Maridath, I want to know your position when it comes to the collective point of view, as you hear an experience of universities, libraries, and researchers on the existing OA models, so the gold and green, do they also hear about CAP or subscribe to open models? Are librarians the ultimate gate openers when it comes to implementing existing open access models, but also the new ones? So what's your stance on this?
Great, thank you, Sally. I'll just wait for you to pull up the slides.
Absolutely. Let me just do that. I'm just going to share the links to all of the press releases and that material here, and then I will share the slides.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for having me here. This is a really exciting topic to talk about. I'm also really pleased that Niamh kind of set the stage well for talking about what can sometimes be contentious negotiations, right, between individual institutions, and what I'll spend some time talking about this morning, consortial negotiations and publishers. So hidden gems, right, finding new OA models together. Heather spoke a little bit about what I call the gemstone models of OA. To your question, Sally, no, I don't think any of the existing OA models are, a silver bullet. I think the most mutually sustainable models are ones that we have not come to yet as an ecosystem, as a community. So, while we hear about these models, again, there's no model that works well for all institutions. Subscribe to Open seems at first like a model that addresses many of the inequities present in, say, Gold OA, but there's simply not a model that I know of that recognizes the ongoing issues around sustainability, diversity, et cetera. Researchers also experience a great deal of friction, right, in the OA space. And one of my colleagues at the Neural Consortium, Julie Linden, wrote a fabulous article that'll be shared out later in 2018 on the model of what we call collections as a service. And this speaks to the value that libraries currently provide their institutions, and that it's no longer about this notion of just simply collecting things. It's really about helping our scholars and instructors navigate publishing, licensing, and relationships with vendors. And why do I think that's important? Well, because when the researchers at our institutions work through the library versus just negotiating with, a one-off publisher on their own, we're able to take the burden of the business side of publication and research off their plates so that they can focus on their scholarship and teaching. It goes without saying, we're also able to advocate for more advantageous terms in our deals because we're advocating on behalf of the entire campus community versus just one researcher. So this hidden gems metaphor, why do I use it? We often get stuck trying to define these different gemstones and like which one is best. And I think that part of what made the negotiations successful with Neural over the last year or two is that we really stopped trying to define these terms as they currently exist in the marketplace and started to try to define what new models would be together. So slide 2, please. So the Neural Consortium had a really historic year of published statements and successful OA negotiations. It goes without saying, I know there's a lot of Europeans in the audience today, that we're different. We don't engage in countrywide negotiations. But I think that one of the things that we learned is that American consortia, and in particular research-intensive consortia like Neural, we really found that our heterogeneity as a group was a singular strength that we could leverage. We're a consortium that's made up of 30 core members of the most research-intensive institutions in the United States. Our member institutions are made up of public research institutions, private institutions, even institutions with law and medical schools. We're also separated by geography, right, which makes us a little different from some other consortia, both in the EU and in the United States that you might be familiar with. Because of our differences, a lot of, again, the existing OA models simply do not work for all of our deal participants. But that's also opened us up to be more creative about, proposed solutions around OA. We found it really beneficial to sort of stand on the shoulders of giants. And I just want to call out that we did some work with what we think of as neighboring consortia, specifically with CRKN. And I just want to say that a lot of our ideation around how to negotiate, is really building on their work. And I'm also aware that CRKN's work really is in conversation and building on the work of the French consortium Couperin. Slide 3. So what does this mean? Well, in practice, we released a statement, Neural demands a better deal, and you'll get the link to this statement later. It sought to codify what we thought a better deal for a diverse group of consortium participants at each stage of their respective OA journeys would look like. So for us, a better deal is a simple deal, both in terms of administration and complexity. It doesn't seek to replicate the challenges of the existing marketplace, but rather to address them. And this was really ultimately a values document that sought to move Neural towards values-based negotiations as a starting point. So our shared values are transparency, sustainability, equity, reproducibility, and flexibility. And all of us know that, values are all well and good, but you have to operationalize them and make them sort of actionable. So how do we solve for these values? How do we, check the box and say, okay, we did that. So that launched into what we call the preferred deal elements, or the PDE for short. So this is the extrapolation of those values, answering questions like, what do we mean when we say transparency? Or what does equity actually look like in a license agreement? So this PDE made the philosophy measurable and actionable. We're also learning that the best deals are co-creative processes that are librarian and consortium led in concert with our publisher partners. We set out clear goals for the work together, timelines, and also off-ramps, right? So exigency strategies if the negotiations break down. There's also clear guidelines on sort of both sides for external communication on the status and the results of the deal negotiations. So once we have our results, this is sort of that third piece, that advocacy piece. We like to share our success and our learnings as widely as possible. And we really see advocacy and engagement as part of those little ripples in the Skalcom pond, and also a way to sort of continue to move that needle towards a more sustainable marketplace. And so this has resulted in, of course, the Neural Elsevier deal and the subsequent press release. There was also a Scholarly Kitchen article, and I'm currently working with some co-authors on an additional article for Commonplace, and a podcast that we're going to launch on what we call the Neural Playbook, right? Which is how we approach a co-creative versus an adversarial negotiation with publishers. So slide 4. So the PDEs, right? So my colleague, Lindsay Cronk, over at University of Rochester, where she's Associate Dean, calls the PDEs our pizza toppings, right? So we really love pizza in America. So this is kind of a good metaphor for us. And I think it works. So I just want to tease this out for a minute. So when you go and you order a pizza, you don't always need every single topping on it, right? Some toppings don't go together. They don't taste good. But, most of us want 1 or 2 toppings on a pizza, right? So we like to have some of the preferred deal elements on every pizza, on every deal, but we don't anticipate that every single one will be or work with every deal. This also clearly acknowledges that negotiations are not purely philosophical, and that it helps us identify what I call our inclusive and exclusive deal elements. So, right, so a better deal would include these things, a better deal would not include these things. This I've also found really helpful, as have other colleagues in Neural, for our own sort of local negotiations, because I have a playbook. I have a document where when I'm working with colleagues here at BU on negotiating our sort of individual licenses, I have a set of shared values and sort of actionable steps to share. Slide 5. So when you're in a group that's fairly heterogeneous, right, as Neural is, you might remember some of us are public, some of us are private, we're all in different states. It can be difficult to agree on the measures of achieving each of the preferred deal elements, which is why approaching the PDE as values has proven really beneficial for us. So here are some of the preferred deal elements, and I'll just go through them quickly. Fees and content. So this ties back to the values of sustainability and transparency. We want fee structures that are rational, tied to real market cost. You know, some of my colleagues here today have talked about what is actually the cost of publication, right? Can we learn that from our publisher partners? Can they share that with us? Should they? Also taking into account the historical spend that each of our library institutions have made for the traditional sort of subscription model, and also the labor of our scholars. Also building on the values, so terms, building on the values of equity, sustainability, and transparency, we seek terms that are no longer than 3 years with appropriate savings tied to longer commitments. Accessibility, data privacy, and removal of non-disclosure language is also important, as Neural recognizes its responsibility to, again, neighboring consortia and the larger community. Opt-in, so building on our core value of transparency, historically Neural offered customizable term links for participating deal members, but we found that syncing participants on the same renewal cycle and allowing members who had previously departed a deal or perhaps never participated in a deal to opt in has provided both a win-win both for Neural members as well as the publisher partners. Open access. So the elimination of embargo periods for institutional repository deposits on the green OA side. Flipping titles to OA where Neural authorship is represented, and securing perpetual access are key drivers with this PDE. Of course, the flipping of the back file to OA was the key OA element for the Neural Elsevier deal. And again, due to differing local institutional OA philosophies and workflows, simply seeking OA models based on APCs or even discounted APCs was not a viable solution for us. Author rights, we strive for first public right where possible, and also the elimination of APCs where possible. Authorized users, seeking the ability for text and data mining for our researchers. We know that this is a really sort of nascent use case for textual resources, and whole book ILL. And also, again, in thinking about our sort of responsibility globally, we also prefer deals where there's no cap or restriction on international ILL. So I think at this point, I'll stop there. I know that's a lot to chew on, and we'll try to take some questions as a panel. Thanks.
Am I on mute? Okay, thank you, Niamh. Thank you for those insights. Can I ask the panelists to unmute themselves? And I see that there are a couple of questions coming in. Perhaps we can first start with Heather. Heather, would you like to take a moment to talk about how you see librarians using data as well? And I will just go through the Q&A and see what we have going on there.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot more from librarians, and I think a lot of the stuff we talked about today, you know, gets back to the data. You know your own researchers, you know your own authors, and the more you can know about them, which connects back with the diversity, equity, and inclusion, then the more intelligent, you know, decisions you can make. So libraries have access to varying qualities of data, sometimes from internal systems like RIMS systems or CRIS systems, sometimes going to an external source like OpenAPC data, or going into Web of Science or Dimensions. And, you know, where are your researchers publishing, and what does your research profile look like with a publisher or with, you know, certain of the large publishers. And depending upon the specialty at your institution, you may see, you can narrow down the types of conversations that you want to have with publishers. You can also figure out if in the negotiation process, you're being offered a good deal. In some instances, the funders require, drawdown of actual APC costs. In other instances, it might be like a token, based system. And publishers, the larger publishers, may have hundreds of different price points across their portfolio. So trying to figure out where researchers are publishing and what the cost will be to do these agreements can be, an intensive process. So we're working with libraries now to figure out how we can give an easy and low cost way to visualize that data, but also, with keeping very squarely in mind that the publishers are walking in, to negotiations with us as well. And, certain fields, if your institution concentrates there and there's not a large appetite for open access, it's quite possible that there are journals that are just not going to flip. They're not dependent on funding from a certain funder. So, it gets at trying to really know your researchers, knowing where they publish, so that you can be best prepared to have the kinds of conversations and make the proposals like Maridath's team did.
All right. So Yasin would like to ask a question. Let's try to change things a bit here. So maybe Yasin, I could ask you to join us live and ask the panelists the question directly. That would be more interactive. Let me give you the rights to talk. There you go.
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, sorry, my webcam doesn't work, but I have a question. How can we take part in finding a new OA model? Thank you.
So I think the question is how can maybe researchers, librarians, the community can sort of join in and help in this, perhaps the creation of new OA models. How do you see that happening? Or do you see that happening?
I can kick off. I think, not to sound like a broken record, but you need to have a really good idea of who your authors are, or if you are on the journal side, particularly in the scholar-led, area, what funding options are going to be available for your researchers and what the preferred access models are for people reading your journal. In many cases, having a really low cost volunteer and scholar-led journal on an open infrastructure platform, can be the way to go, particularly in the social sciences or humanities, where there's not going to be 1,000 articles, per year, and that can be handled. When I was at PubPub, we work with a lot of journals that were kind of starting from that square. But if you are an established journal, look at your funder information. If you're collecting that, if you're not collecting it, you may want to collect it. Look at your demographics, how many regions of the world are represented. Again, it gets back to the data, and that might not be an easy thing to get your brain around. But if you're going to be moving forward, you want to be as best prepared, as possible.
I think a couple of things, just leading on from what you've said, Heather. I think one thing that's really important is just to continue to be able to experiment. And I mean, that's one of the things that, we've certainly thought about a lot. So I think if you have ideas about how something might work, one of the things, like if you are a researcher or you're working in an institution, if there's an opportunity to talk to your librarian, I would sort of consider starting there, actually looking at what's there as well in the journals that you publish in. And thinking, or that you read, thinking about what you would like to see and finding ways that you can make suggestions about how you think that might work. But I would really consider engaging with your librarian, because I think a lot of the time, as Maridath mentioned, there's a huge amount of kind of background work that isn't always super visible if that's not kind of where your day-to-day focus is. And I think, you'll be able to learn a lot from there and then be able to use that to think about how you might be able to contribute. So, I think it's like everything else, keeping an open mind, being inquisitive and interested in how things might work differently, being able to challenge a bit, but also that data and learning is really important. So I think that's always a good place to start.
Harriet would like to know if there's a live transcription, not on YouTube either. So what we try to do is parallel to this, because we have over 260 people who registered. So we try to live stream parallel to this, and there all the good stuff will be shared, including the slides and the links that the panelists have shared with me today. So maybe we can, if there are no any other questions, maybe we can talk about any final thoughts that the panelists would like to share, or questions that you might have for each other. Maybe we can take a minute or two, a couple of minutes to go through that, or final thoughts that you would like to share before we wrap up.
I'd just like to say that around, issues around transparency and costs, some publishers get concerned that these conversations can lead into a conflict of interest or, a problem around competition and that kind of thing. And not that there's, no validity to that, but I think there's a lot of pre-competitive and non-competitive type discussions and collaborations either already underway or that potentially can come, which we can learn from each other and explore some of these new models. And I like the new sense of openness in the industry.
I'll just say also, kind of as a final thought, that and others that have heard me speak before have heard me say this. I think it's really important for us to all recognize at this juncture, libraries, publishers, and researchers, that our shared survival is tied up in each other, and what we've been doing is no longer serving us, right? It's no longer working. It's completely unsustainable. And so it's going to take the creativity of all three of those stakeholder groups to really address some of the key issues that the panelists have laid out here today.
I couldn't agree with more on that. And also just picking up on the point you made as you're speaking, and that Heather made too. I mean, the importance of data in all of this is just so big. And that's a challenge that I think everyone is experiencing in different ways. With these changes comes the need to sometimes reverse engineer systems or data to produce information that wasn't what we were thinking of when they were set up. And I think, that's something where that kind of collaboration and being able to work together is so important. But I'm looking forward to some, I hope to see some good developments in that coming over kind of the next few years as well. And I think it'd be really interesting to see where that takes us.
Spot on. Okay, well, on behalf of everyone joining us today, I would like to thank the panelists for their valuable insights and their precious time, because it's true that they are coming from different time zones, and for some it's very early. So thank you very much for your precious time and for your valuable insights. Just to remind you all, that we organize these webinars once every 2 months. So please follow us across our channels. We'll be talking about challenges for open institutional repositories in our next webinar. So stay tuned for that. And for those of you who joined us late, you can always find the replay for all of these webinars on the My Science Work YouTube channel. And on that note, I wish you a good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And speak to you soon again here sometime in the future. Have a good day.
Thank you.